Hey kids, it's Miss Hiller, and I'm coming to you to teach you a little bit about civil rights. This is the second module that we're doing. The first one was on the Cold War. I hope you did those activities. This next one is on civil rights, and the last module, module 3, we're coming close to the end, is going to be on the 1960s. So I'm just going to walk you through a quick PowerPoint and talk to you a little bit about what's going on in civil rights. And there's 3 activities that you need to do for this 2-week module. So if you've been doing the assignments, great. Go ahead and keep up the good work. Really, the school has made it pretty doable for you to be able to, recover your grade and pass for the year. So I'm hoping that we can get 100% pass rate in my classes. All right, so we're going to get started here. Okay, so, civil rights has been something African Americans have been fighting for since the beginning of our country, even before the beginning of our country, since slaves came over in 1916 in Jamestown. And you know that it's been a constant struggle since then, especially down in the South. And even after the Civil War is won by the North, the gains in the South are very slow because of the Jim Crow laws and the policy of segregation. So again, a long, hard struggle. And just because we talk mostly about the South, when we talk about racism and discrimination, you need to realize that this is happening in the North as well. It's not as institutional, it's not as ingrained, it's not in the law, but people are still being racist and discriminatory towards minority groups. All right, so this is the March on Washington in 1963. So the Civil War ends in 1865, and African Americans are still fighting for equal rights in 1963. And as you know, the fight even continues now, and it's 2020. Of course, this is when Martin Luther King Jr. sort of is on the scene. And he's going to organize this huge march on Washington. And this is going to be civil disobedience, peaceful protest to try to get laws changed. Okay, so what's happening in 1963? John F. Kennedy, who's liberal and sympathetic towards the African Americans' plight, he's going to send a civil rights bill to Congress, which had tabled it. Okay, and then Dr. King is going to organize a march on Washington to bring pressure on Congress to pass this bill, which they, put to the side there. On August 28th, King appeared before a crowd of 250,000 at Lincoln Memorial, and you might be familiar with the I Have a Dream speech, of course. And here's a picture of that. Okay, this is an actual picture, so we know that's a primary source because it was taken in 1963. And of course, people there were moved by a I Have a Dream speech, which is quite phenomenal if you read the words and you really think about it. Public opinion begins to support civil rights legislation. It's very powerful because people who have been put down for hundreds of years are willing to protest in a nonviolent way. And not everybody around the world in our country, has been capable of doing that. Unfortunately, they had a friend, African Americans had a friend with JFK, but he's going to get assassinated in November of 1963 in Dallas. This was a huge event. It was very devastating to the country to have such a young, sort of popular, somewhat nice-looking president be cut down like that. And when the president dies, the vice president takes over, and now the civil rights legislation is going to be put on Lyndon Baines Johnson's desk. Okay, so who kills JFK? It's Lee Harvey Oswald, and he was believed to be the lone gunman, although there's lots of conspiracy theories out there. One of the activities for this module is about JFK and Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay, so this was devastating to African Americans, the loss of JFK, but the fight for civil rights is still going to continue. This particular primary source picture here is of JFK and his younger brother, Bobby. And Bobby is also assassinated in 1968 when he was running for president. So the Kennedy family has suffered a lot of loss. All right, so now Lyndon Baines Johnson, being from Texas, here he is back here, he ends up being an advocate for the civil rights movement as well. And Johnson is going to, he's a pretty pushy, very tall Texan, an in your face type of guy, and he's going to push that legislation through. And basically, there's going to be some great gains made under the Johnson administration. LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, saw equal rights as a part of his program called the Great Society. Okay, so one of the big pieces of legislation is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's pressure from the March, and LBJ forced Congress to sign the measure. This act prohibited discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, and gender. It also integrated public accommodations. Using the Interstate Commerce Clause on the Constitution, the law was enforceable. So this happens in 1964, and you might say, oh, I thought it happened in the 1950s. Well, what happened in the 1950s is the Supreme Court case Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, which is going to integrate the schools. But that's just the public schools. And so now this piece of legislation 10 years later in 1964 is going to integrate all public accommodations, not just schools. Okay, Dr. King organizes a march to raise awareness for voting rights in Selma in 1965. The nonviolent protesters were attacked by the police with fire hoses and dogs, and you can see this picture right here. This raised public opinion to support a new voting rights law. So people are seeing this, people are starting to get TVs, and they're seeing this on the news, and they're seeing that the protesters are peaceful. They might not be obeying what the police are saying, but they're standing up for their rights. And the police are becoming violent in the way that they handle the protesters. And people are seeing this play out on TV, and it's changing people's minds about the civil rights movement. So this raised public opinion to support a new voting rights law. Okay, so we have the Civil Rights Act of 64. Now we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965. African Americans, according to the Constitution, shouldn't have been able to vote, and some of them did immediately after the Civil War. But those Jim Crow laws were passed in localities in the South that kept Black people from voting. So not a lot of African Americans were voting. Well, they're going to finally outlaw literacy tests as a voting qualification. Federal registrars were sent to the South to register voters. It provided for marshals to investigate acts of discrimination. African Americans were intimidated if they showed up to vote at the polls, if there's a bunch of people waiting for them that, might be part of the Klan or might be part of the local sheriff's office that is racist. Okay, so when they make these improvements, it's going to result in a large increase in Black voting in the South. And LBJ, that's our president again, used coercive tactics to get Congress to pass this law. He'd make it pretty obvious. He'd call these Congress members into his office one-on-one, and he'd make it pretty obvious that he needed their support on these civil rights acts, or they're not going to gain his support for any pieces of legislation they might want to get passed through, that benefits their constituents. All right, so some of the terms you need to know are civil disobedience. Okay, this is the refusal to obey an unjust law and accept the consequence, and it's advocated by Martin Luther King Jr. We know Rosa Parks gets arrested, Martin Luther King Jr. gets arrested, and they're getting arrested because, they're not obeying the law, but it is an unjust law. And they're not using violence as they obey the law. Okay, nonviolence, of course, is peaceful protest advocated by Martin Luther King Jr. And of course, the Mahatma Gandhi in India was one of his role models that used nonviolent civil disobedience. And of course, the term Black Power. So some people wanted to be a little bit more militant. So this was a more militant movement of the late 1960s, which lost patience with the nonviolent protest. This was advocated by the Black Panthers and Malcolm X. Here's a picture of Malcolm X right here. He's also, unfortunately, going to get assassinated in the 1960s. So a lot of great civil rights leaders are getting assassinated, both white and Black, during the 1960s. Okay, an organization that tries to advance African Americans is known as the NAACP. Those initials stand for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. It's organized in 1909 by many Americans, including W.E.B. Du Bois. Also, Ida B. Wells was involved in that as well, and they worked for political, social, and economic equality. The organization challenged segregation in the courts, and they wanted to find a case of someone's rights being denied. Okay, and then they would bring that to the court system to try to get eventually legislation to be changed. Of course, that's what they do with Brown v. Board in 1954. Through congressional lobbying and challenging laws in the courts, the NAACP continues to work for all Americans of color. We had an NAACP in Albemarle. We had one in Charlottesville. In 2001, they're going to combine to be one group. And in 2003, Dr. Rick Turner becomes very much involved in running the combined NAACP for Charlottesville and Albemarle. And he's also going to be working with the University of Virginia chapter of the NAACP as well. He is no longer the president. The president now is a lady named Jeanette Martin. And let's say you were working for the hospital and you feel that you got terminated, and you feel that the person that terminated you was racist. So you might go to your local chapter of the NAACP to see if they could help support you and lobby for you, or maybe even go to court for you. So this organization is alive and well and still very active. Okay, what are the legacies of these protests? By interpreting its power broadly, the Supreme Court can reshape American society. And I think the biggest thing that you can see, of course, is Brown versus Board of Education. Things don't happen immediately, though. That court case happened in 1954, and really in Charlottesville, the schools are getting pushed to do this. In 1958, they pretty much say, we're going to close the schools down. So right now, with the coronavirus, of course, schools are shut down. Schools shut down for almost a year in Charlottesville. And then in 1959, they opened up again with allowing African Americans to go to Venable and African Americans go to Lane. And Lane was the high school back then before Charlottesville High School. Okay, changing public opinion was necessary in order for the government to respond with new legislation. And that peaceful protest that was led by Martin Luther King Jr. Basically changed people's minds to support civil rights legislation. Okay, and of course, African Americans wanted this. When I talk about changing people's minds, well, that would be white America. Nonviolent protests seem to get the most positive results from the American society, and the concepts of civil rights are still issues in politics today. So, it's been a long road, but things have progressively gotten better. And of course, in 2008, we had an African American president elected, and he wasn't elected by just 13% of the population, which is the percentage of the population that is made up by African Americans. He won with a majority of the votes, over 50% of the votes. So he had a lot of white support as well as other cohorts supporting him. So this is a sign that America is definitely improving, although we still have a long way to go. Okay, do your 3 activities that are on this module, and I'll talk to you in the next 2 weeks with Module 3 when we cover the 1960s. Stay safe. I don't even know.